All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we look at great theories of everything ancient and modern. Try to suss out how you can use these things in your own life to help you with your paradigm shifting or your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, among other things. And today is our 528th video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. Mr. Larson was an American engineer who lived in the 20th century. He died in 1990, and before he did, he published many works, and we're looking at one of those today. We're looking at one of his books on economics, I guess macroeconomics, called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. But Larson also has books on physics and chemistry, and astronomy, also metaphysics, including philosophy and religion and biology, psychology, and some of his associates have written books on other topics, geology and meteorology, crypto history, ancient archaeology, things like that. Larson's theory is a general theory. It can be applied to any subject. So that's why we like to survey all of his books so that we can kind of understand how he applies his basic theory to these varied subjects. And that might shed some light on how to apply it to whatever subject we'd like to apply it to. And so if you go into my archives, you can see all the different works that we have done in the past. Also, if you'd like to get a very detailed description, not very detailed, but at least somewhat detailed description of Larson's theory and its ramifications, you want to watch an earlier video, probably one of my first 474 that I've done on the subject. But for the purposes of today, we're just going to kind of move forward and get into the economic stuff. Will tell you that in 1959, Larson proposed his two fundamental postulates about how he believed the universe operated. He was one of the only scientists who has proposed a universe made out of motion. There have been others, but not many. And for Larson, the universe is not made out of matter, not made out of energy, but it is made out of motion. And in particular, a motion that he calls scalar motion, a motion that has a magnitude but has no specific direction. And for Larson, motion was the relationship between space and time. And this sets out a reciprocal relationship between space and time. So basically, speed, matter, energy, force, all of our scientific quantities are fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator, with the caveat that both space or time can have multiple exponents. So you can have time to the first, second, third, or more powers, space to the first, second, third, or more powers. And so, for example, matter is time to the third over space to the third, whereas energy is just time over space. Speed, obviously, is just space over time. I was walking at 2 miles per hour, 2 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space over time. Acceleration is space over time to the second power, and so on and so forth. And that is the basis from which Larson put together his theoretical universe, what his universe would look like if his postulates were correct. And then he was able to arrive at equations and so on for the various different books that he wrote to plug into all of these different subjects. And so we're going to see how he does this with economics. Now, now we're in chapter 4 here, which we started yesterday, and chapter 4 is on value. The first couple chapters, he was talking about the scientific approach, that most economists are what he would call sociological economists, where they have a certain political axe to grind, whether they want to help the poor or forward some kind of free market, something or another, and that goes into their approach to economics. Larson is saying you can't do that. Economics is a science, and you have to be, you can do that, but you have to base your science, base your economic theory on facts, like a scientist would. If you construct a bridge, if it doesn't follow the laws of physics, it's going to collapse. And the same with your economic system. And one of Larson's colleagues, Ron Satz, he actually calls it econophysics. So Larson tries to boil it down there with his economic theory to what he calls the Robinson Crusoe situation, where you're starting with just one isolated person on a deserted island, and trying to figure out the rudiments of the economic system, and that the economic system has various stages. First, you're just he basically says, okay, first there's an iron law. You have work or starve. That is the iron law of economics. You have to do some work, or else you're going to starve to death. And then that the most fundamental parts about the economic system are production and consumption, and that the economic system goes through various stages. The first stage is where the producer is the consumer. You're just like a Crusoe type situation, where you produce and then you consume what you produce. But then there is the next stage where you have some type of barter, where you produce something and then you trade it to somebody else who produced something else, so that you can get that something else as well as what you produced yourself. And then eventually the money enters the situation, and everything becomes more complicated. But so Larson wants to boil it down to this Crusoe situation, so we can kind of get down to brass tacks and see what is really driving the economic system before we start creating policies. Okay, so we're going to start here. I kind of cut off in the middle of a long paragraph last time because I wasn't really cognizant of the time. And we're going to start that paragraph over again and then move on from there. Okay, the scientist knows that energy, which is something, does not appear in any ordinary physical process. The amount of energy coming out of such a process is exactly equal to that which entered. So he was talking about the conservation laws of physics, before. Various entities are conserved, and that is of great use to physicists to be able to rely on those laws. But it is by no means self-evident that this result is inescapable, and the fact that energy is conserved was not discovered until after modern scientific techniques had been perfected and applied to the problem. In the less advanced field of economics, the fact that certain economic quantities analogous to energy are also conserved has not heretofore been recognized. But application of the powerful methods of physical science in the investigation whose results are being reported herein has demonstrated that purchasing power is the kind of a persistent economic entity to which we can apply the techniques of factual science. He was saying, purchasing power and goods are basically the same thing from two different perspectives. And so if you are a producer, you produce something, and that is purchasing power, because it gives you the opportunity to barter or trade with that to somebody else, to give yourself some ability to buy something, and to the consumer, that is goods. Okay, so those are the two fundamental quantities that he's talking about being conserved: purchasing power and goods. At least the way I'm understanding what he's talking about here. Okay, so once purchasing power has been produced, we can follow it from process to process, just as the scientist does with energy, knowing that what was originally produced will remain intact until its existence is terminated by consumption, or the equivalent. Thus, the clarification of this point is the first in a series of moves, which ultimately bring the economic mechanism out of the quagmire of assumption and speculation onto solid ground, where we can subject it to exact logical and mathematical analysis. It was emphasized in the course of the discussion in the preceding pages that application of factual scientific methods in the economic field would not simply rework the territory that has been covered by the economists, but would penetrate into new areas that are less effective methods of the social sciences, that the less effective methods of the social scientists have been unable to reach. The significance of this forecast can now be seen. The main line of development of theory from this point on will take the form of a study and analysis of the various aspects of that which the economists claim does not exist: a stable economic quantity, purchasing power, that is subject to a conservation law in essentially the same manner as energy in the physical field. Before we can proceed further with our analysis, however, it will be necessary to give some consideration to the question of measurement. Some classes of goods can be measured physically by counting, weighing, or some such process, but this does not give us an economic measurement. Since payment for goods must be made in other goods, the economic measurement of goods must also be made in terms of goods. We will call the quantity thus measured the value of the goods. The measurement standard may be either some one commodity or the weighted average of a number of goods. Inasmuch as purchasing decisions are made by individuals acting for themselves or on behalf of others, the economically significant assessments of the relative value of different goods are those that are made by these individuals. This means that value is subjective. It is value to a specific individual and at a specific time and place. It follows that values vary not only between individuals, but also between different times and locations. Furthermore, goods have two values in each case, a value as purchasing power, which we will call seller's value, and a value as consumption goods, which we will call buyer's value. From the very beginning of the systematic study of economics, there has been a great deal of controversy over the question as to the meaning which should be assigned to the word value, and some of the most important differences between the various schools of economic thought can be traced back to the different concepts of value. Knut Wicksell even contended that the concept of value is the essence of an economic doctrine. He asserted that, quote, "It is well known that almost every new school of thought in political economy has laid down its own theory of value, and from this, as it were, derived its entire character," end quote. In fact, no definition has any more claim to validity than another. A definition is simply a description of the concept that it is to be associated with the term defined, and as long as this association is rigidly maintained, the logic of the terminology is unassailable, regardless of any exception that may be taken on the grounds that the definition conflicts with prevailing image, causes confusion, etc. Any relations that may be developed in the subsequent analysis are between concepts, not between words, and if the words clearly indicate the concepts to which they refer, they are performing their proper function. No definition can be wrong as long as it is only a definition and nothing else. It may be ill-advised, even absurd, if it is greatly out of step with the accepted usage, but it cannot be wrong if it is self-consistent and consistently used. Consistent use of a definition is, however, no easy task in a case where there is a pre-existing popular meaning associated with the term defined. In spite of good intentions on the part of those who set up other definitions, it is extremely difficult to avoid slipping into the use of both concepts in the same argument, thereby transferring relations that are valid for one concept over to another for which they may be totally invalid. Precise definition of all quantities and concepts that are utilized is an essential feature of a sound scientific analysis. The non-scientist usually claims that he, too, defines his terms with as much precision as the subject matter will permit, but even within the non-scientific professional circles, the lack of conceptual precision is recognized by careful observers. For example, in a book entitled Economic Thought and Language, L.M. Fraser views the situation in economics in this light. Quote, "Economists have always suffered, as compared with natural scientists, from the inaccuracy of their linguistic equipment. Many of the disagreements which divide them are terminological rather than genuinely economic in character," end quote. The first essential for a scientific treatment of the factual aspects of economics, the kind of a scientific treatment that we are describing in this volume, is to begin by identifying the concepts that we are going to use. The economic relations with which we will be dealing are relations between concepts. The names that we apply to them are merely labels by which we identify the concepts. Starting with the term value and trying to attach a meaning to it is putting the cart before the horse. What we are doing is setting up and defining our concepts, then looking for appropriate names to apply to them. One of the concepts that we will use in our analysis happens to coincide almost exactly with the layman's idea of value and what the item in question is worth. So, quote, worth. So, for this reason, together with the points previously mentioned, we will utilize this term in referring to it. Since the alternate definitions will not be used herein, there is no actual necessity to give them any further consideration here. However, it may be helpful to explain just how the value concept defined and discussed in these pages differs from each of the two most widely accepted alternatives. Karl Marx's theory, the basis of the so-called Marxist economic systems, defines the value of goods as equal to the amount of labor expended in their production. His special targets are the capitalists, in quotes, who, in his opinion, exploit the workers by means of their ownership of production facilities and divert to themselves a substantial part of the proceeds that should accrue to the workers. Here we have an illustration of the detrimental effects of mixing sociological concerns with economics. Capitalists are a social class, not an economic class. For efficient production, it is necessary to have capital, and suppliers of capital are therefore essential to the economy. But, as noted earlier, these suppliers of capital, an economic class, are not necessarily capitalists. In some types of economic organization, they are never capitalists, and it is not essential that they be capitalists in any economic system. Since capitalists as such play no part in economic activity, the use of the term capitalist or capitalistic in application to an economic organization or to economic processes is definitely out of order. A social organization may be capitalistic in the sense that it provides for the existence of a class of individuals who obtain their income mainly from invested capital, but the existence of such a class is not dependent on any particular type of economic organization. Today, even the most dedicated collectivist governments meet part of their capital requirements by selling bonds or by borrowing from foreign sources. The inescapable fact is that the required capital must be obtained from individuals, either by borrowing from them or by using governmental powers to take an additional slice out of their incomes. Obviously, borrowing is not possible unless the lenders are promised compensation. Thus, Marx's contention that the entire product belongs to the worker is true from the economic standpoint only if the worker is the supplier of capital. His argument is therefore social rather than economic. It is really an argument in favor of a social and political organization in which it is possible to compel the workers to supply the capital needed for production so that they can reap the benefits of ownership. Whether or not this is desirable is outside the scope of economic science. If it has any connection with economics, that connection is with the sociological branch of the subject. The worker ownership that Marx wanted to achieve is not incompatible with any type of economic organization. However, From the standpoint of economic science, it should be noted that the theory of value that Marx developed to support his social and political objectives is subject to the same logical defect that we have previously mentioned as applying to all of the economists' theories of value. That is, it changes definitions in the middle of the argument without admitting this. In order to bolster his contention that the workers should receive the full value of the production in which they participate, he formulated a theory which characterizes the amount of labor applied to the production of economic goods as the value of those goods. But value, as thus defined, is a concept that plays no significant part in economic life. So Marx changes horses in midstream. To complete his argument, he shifts to the definition of value as that which goods are worth, thus arriving at the conclusion that what goods are worth is the amount of labor that has been expended in producing them. Obviously, this is not true in the economic sense of worth. The purpose of economic goods is to satisfy human wants of an economic nature. There are necessarily the wants of individuals. Economic worth is therefore the worth to individual consumers. This worth has no definite relation to the amount of labor that has been expended in their production. Much labor is expended, particularly in those economics or those economies that operate on Marxist principles, on the production of goods that are not wanted by the consumers. On the other hand, it is not uncommon for the results of some production operation, such as the drilling of an oil well or the invention of a labor-saving device, to be worth vastly more than the labor expended. Sooner or later, in every economic transaction or discussion, it becomes necessary to make use of the concept of economic value as we have defined it, that is, that which anything is worth, in the sense of that which an individual is willing and able to pay for it at a specific place and time. This does not mean that the concept must necessarily be called value. The economists are entitled to define their concepts as they see fit and to call them by whatever means they consider appropriate. But we are justified in demanding that whatever definitions they formulate be adhered to throughout each of their arguments. This they cannot do if they define value in terms other than those used in the definition stated herein. Everywhere in the economic field, the concept of worth of goods, the concept to which the layman applies the term value, continually arises, and no matter how pure their intentions may be at the outset, the economists eventually lay their own definitions aside and start treating value as worth. But by this process of jumping across a wide conceptual gap and changing definitions in the middle of their arguments, they arrive at totally unwarranted conclusions with respect to the special kind of value that they have set up. The, quote, the disentangling of the various concepts involved, says Fraser, is painful and difficult business. Value, as defined in the foregoing pages, is a difficult quantity to measure. It is not an inherent characteristic of the economic good, but a subjective quantity, an individual's estimate of the worth to him for the group on whose behalf he is acting at a particular time and place. Bird's nest soup has a value to the Chinese, but not to the American. Ice has a value in Palm Springs, but not in Greenland. Today's newspaper has a value today, but not next month, and so on. The extreme amount of variability in value as thus defined makes it hard to work with, which probably accounts for the modern economist's practice of using another of the alternative definitions of value. The policy now prevailing is to equate value in general with exchange value, which is merely another name for market price. By means of this expedient, the layman's concept of value that is so difficult to handle is discarded and replaced by a more tractable quantity. But the subjective concept of worth cannot be eliminated from economics. It plays a very important part in economic life, and the economists must use it. Consequently, they are doing just what Marx did. They are using the term value in both senses in the same arguments. It would be quite understandable if the economists took the position that value, in the sense of worth, being difficult to measure, has only a limited usefulness in economics and cannot be made the basis of any exact quantitative relations. We are very familiar with physical entities which have this same status. Odors, for example, are extremely difficult to measure, and for this reason, no mathematical science of odor comparable to those built around sound and light has ever been developed. But we would never consider for a moment any thought that we might pick out some other quantity that would be easier to measure, call this odor, and then substitute it for odor in the development of a theory. Even if measurement is impossible, the substitution of an irrelevant measurable quantity for a relevant immeasurable quantity is indefensible. The real issue involved in the value controversy is whether or not the consumer should be allowed to make their own choices. The Marxists and others who see the situation from the sociological viewpoint take the stand that most consumers are not competent to judge what is best for them, and that the decisions should be made by individuals who are better qualified. Furthermore, it is the contention of the Marxists that there are aspects of the production decisions that are the concern of the state rather than of the consumers, and that these decisions should therefore be made by government agencies. Whether or not these contentions have merit, they are social and political issues, not